Recently, you may have seen my video investigating the development of Project H.A.M.M.E.R. As is often the case with these kind of investigations, when gaining lots of different contacts around a game's development like that, you end up compiling information on other projects as well. With input from Nintendo Software Technology, Nintendo of America, even a bit higher up in the hierarchy, I've been able to get a few new interesting bits of info on past entries in the Metroid series. During their work on Project H.A.M.M.E.R, NST was of course handling a Metroid game themselves, Metroid Prime Hunters on the DS. The standout feature of that game undoubtedly was its multiplayer, which is why some of the stories a couple of its developers recounted to me came as a bit of a surprise. Originally, Hunters was actually pitched as a strictly single-player game. It was intended to replicate the same type of experience that Retro had built on the GameCube with the other Prime games on a portable. However, when the core of development actually began, NST soon found that to be a much more difficult task than previously thought. The developers really struggled to create a single-player mode that was interesting, and they weren't above admitting it to themselves. Then, local multiplayer was added, which you may remember seeing at E3 2004 during the game's unveiling, but back then it was completely bare bones. Nintendo at the time had no plans to implement online multiplayer, which ended up being the defining feature for many people in the end. In the background of NST's designers racking their brains about how to fix this, some of the engineers had begun experimenting with expanding the scope of the multiplayer with more characters and adding online support. Everyone agreed that what these members of the team had conceived of was much more fun. Thus, 3 to 4 months after the first Hunt demo was released, it was decided that the project would take on a completely new direction. The game suddenly went from being all about a portable solo experience to now focusing almost solely on multiplayer. With NST having certain deadlines to meet along with budgetary limits, they were never able to create the big single-player experience they had originally envisioned. What ended up happening was that the designers transferred a lot of the work done on the multiplayer over into the remnants of the story mode and going from there. Or to quote one NST source directly, the designers simply used it to make a mediocre single player at the last minute. That person wasn't kidding either. Most of the single player seems to have been cobbled together within the final months. One of the other projects I've been looking into a little bit is the elusive Metroid Dread, which we are still asked about all the time, perhaps more than any other Nintendo game actually. Metroid Dread was a 2D Metroid in development for the DS that was intended to take place after the events of Metroid Fusion. Rumours about the game waged on for years throughout the 2000s, and ultimately very little solid info came out about it. Sakamoto indirectly confirmed the game's existence some years back, but wouldn't really elaborate past that. The truth is that we know very little about it. Nintendo is like a fortress sometimes when it comes to these kind of things, but I was able to establish a few details about its development. It seems that ideas for the game were established years before they began actually starting on its core development. The project found its beginnings in 2005 and existed only as design documents and ideas among certain staff members like Sakamoto. No actual pre-production began on it back then, however, for reasons still not entirely clear to me. One very well placed source at NOA suggested that NST was being considered for having a role in the project pending their work on Hunters. Ultimately, despite Hunters receiving positive reviews and certainly finding an audience, much of NCL didn't really approve of it. Thus, years later in late 2008, development on Dread was actually underway for a little while without their input at NCL itself. It was extensively prototyped, but doesn't seem to have gotten much further than this. At a pre-E3 event in 2009, a number of staff members from first-party Nintendo development houses, including NST, were invited to see the game in an early form behind closed doors. According to a few very trustworthy sources related to NST, who were part of my research into Machine X, the game used a very similar 2D sprite art style in the vein of Metroid Fusion. In fact, one person even went as far as saying it literally looked like a port of Fusion on DS. One developer told me that at this point the game was no longer even called Dread, it had abandoned that subtitle and was simply codenamed Metroid. This indicates that Dread was likely an early codename or working title considered during preliminary planning. Soon after this, the game disappeared. It was expected to be shown at some point over the following year, but never surfaced. A couple of the people I spoke to offered theories on why this might have been, but nobody was able to offer me a definitive explanation for this, unfortunately. Lastly, Recently, a few people were asking me if NST has any role in the development of Metroid Prime Federation Force for the 3DS. They developed the last and so far only other first-person Metroid on a handheld, and the games have a similar look about them, so I can see why people might want to ask this. The short answer is no. As I mentioned in the Project H.A.M.M.E.R video, Nintendo really did relegate them down their list of priority studios after the events of that game's development. You might be surprised to find out, however, just the extent at which they were excluded from Federation Force. Not only have they never been consulted, they were never even made aware of its existence. Nobody at NST was told that such a game was in development, and everyone there found out at the same time as everyone else during the E3 announcement, much to the upset of the remaining Hunters developers. We'll continue to dig up more info on Metroid in the future, so don't forget to subscribe if this was of interest. I've also developed some insight into the future of the series, so stay tuned for that.